know that according to the latest United States statistics, there are over 13 million widows in the United States alone. 13 million. Now, third world countries, they have quite a larger number than us. China has 43 million widows. India, where I've been 4 times, has 42 million widows. In fact, they tell us each year the United States has 700 to 800,000 women who become widows. That's crazy. 700,000 to 800,000 women that become widows. And of all those women, 700,000 to 800,000, they say 7 out of 10 of those women will end up living alone. 7 out of 10. Now, ladies, those are concerning statistics that should move our hearts with compassion. But unfortunately, the church somehow has forgotten what the Holy Scriptures say about widows. We have forgotten James 1:27 that says true religion is this, to visit, and it doesn't mean you just go knock on their door to say hello, to visit the fatherless, the orphans, and the widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. Some of us have substituted James 1:27 and have said true religion is this. True religion is reading my Bible every day. Or true religion is going to church every Sunday. Or true religion is memorizing Scripture. And even though those are good disciplines to have in place, we need to remember what Christ says, and that is true religion is to visit the orphans and the widows in their affliction. And so let's see what God has to say tonight through 1 Timothy 5, verses 3 to 10, as we look at a destitute, a defended, and a dead widow. I'm sure you're wondering about that. 1 Timothy 5, 3 through 10. Paul says this to Timothy, honor widows who are really widows. But if any widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show piety at home and to repay their parents. For this is good and acceptable before God. Now she who is really a widow and left alone, trusts in God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day, but she who lives in pleasure is dead while she lives. And these things command that they might be blameless. But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his own household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Do not let a widow under 60 years be taken into the number, not unless she's been the wife of one man, well reported of for good works, if she's brought up children, if she's lodged strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has relieved the afflicted, if she has diligently followed every good work. Now, we started chapter 5 last week with looking on how to exhort fellow family members of the Church of God. We saw that Paul exhorted Timothy on how he is to exhort an old man and a young man and an older woman and a younger woman. And we also saw that we could use that in our lives as women, looking at how do we confront an older man in the church, how do we confront someone who is the same age or younger, and then how do we confront women who are older, and then how do we confront women who are the same age or younger. And so Paul is continuing on with Timothy, instructing him on how to treat certain church members, and specifically here on how to treat widows. And tonight we're going to look at how he is to treat the older widows, and then next week we're going to look at the younger widows, and we're also going to bridge that into what young women are to be doing. And I expect you all to be here next week because it's going to be a convicting lesson. It is a convicting lesson, but so is tonight. But as we consider the text, we're going to see 3 types of widows and certain things about them. We're going to look at 3 types of widows tonight: a destitute widow, we're going to look at a dead widow, and we're going to look at a defended widow. And I will share what each one of those are when we come to them, and also give you some descriptions about those. So let's begin this important section on widows by defining what is a widow. Look at verse 3. Paul says, honor widows who are really widows. So Paul starts this section by telling Timothy he is to honor widows. So that begs the question, what does it mean to honor a widow? It means to respect her, to revere her, and especially here in the Greek wordage, it means to protect and honor her with financial support. And this is a far cry from our world today, which disdains drugs and disposes of the elderly. Ladies, I think our Father in heaven must be very grieved with the American culture and what we are doing to our aged parents. It is a far cry from what Paul says here. We are to honor the widows. We are to honor the aged. Now, notice what he says next. We honor widows who are really widows. Now, this might be puzzling at first, but let's define what a widow is. In fact, one of the groups just asked me, what does this mean? What is a widow? Well, the Greek word for widow is monos, only alone. It just means that she is without. She's without. She is without a husband. She's without family. She might be widowed in the sense that her husband died. But she also might be a widow because she's divorced. She also would be a widow if her husband deserted her. Paul talks about that. In 1 Corinthians 7, he says, if an unbeliever departs, let him go. Let him go. You're not under bondage. But that means she's no longer married. Also, it would include a single woman who's never been married. She is without. She has no means of support. She might be old, as we'll see tonight, but she might be young, as we will see next week from verse 11. But all widows who are real widows are to be honored. Now, a real widow would be one who's truly destitute. She has no one to help her. She has no family. In the biblical world, if a woman's husband died, she could either remain in the husband's house, she could go back to her parents' house, she could move in with her in-laws, like we saw Ruth doing with Naomi, but those were pretty much her options. She also could, if there was a brother of her husband, he was to marry her, or the nearest relative was to marry her. And so those were kind of all of her choices. Now remember, we're talking in the biblical world. In the biblical world, if your husband died or you were without a husband, you would have no means to get income. Today we have, Social Security. Most of us who are married, our husbands have life insurance, or we have the ability to go out and get a job. I was talking to a pastor's wife the other day, and we were both sharing how neither one of our husbands have Social Security. As a pastor, you can file for exemption. And when Doug went into the pastorate, he filed to be exempt from Social Security. So and her husband did the same. And I said, well, it's going to be interesting when our husbands die. And she said, yeah, I'm going to be one of those old people at Walmart, And but we were just talking about how we knew the Lord would provide for us. But we have all these things. We have Social Security, we have life insurance, we can go out and get a job. But this would not be normal in the biblical world. The women were not prominent in the workplace like we see today, and so she would need financial support. But ladies, even in our world where we're blessed to have some of these advantages, we still have biblical responsibilities as a church to financially care for widows. And it might not just be financial support, it should be spiritual support, emotional support, but we need to be providing for the widows in our churches. So, this is the first thing we see about widows who are destitute. We're talking about a destitute widow. Here's the first thing we see about her. The church should provide for her. The church should provide for her. Now, there are some widows that are truly widows, but they are to be provided for by their families. They're not destitute. They are not without help. And I call this the defended widow. She's defended because she has family to care for her. Look at verse 4. If any widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show piety at home, repay their parents, for this is good and acceptable before God. Now, the Greek word but is a contrast. In contrast to the widows who have no one, nobody, they have no family at all. We have this widow over here, she has family. She has children, she has grandchildren. Your translation might say nephews, but the translation of that, the better translation, is grandchildren. So she has grandchildren, she has children. And they are to first learn to show piety at home. In other words, their duty as a child or a grandchild is to show their holiness at first in their home by taking care of their parents. Ladies, this is where real religion fleshes out. In fact, at the time Paul was writing this letter to Timothy, it was legally binding for a family to take care of their parents. That was legal during that time. It would have been illegal to not care for your parents. In fact, to not care for your parents in the biblical world would be unthinkable. And you know, if you go to some of these third world countries, I'm sure Betsy could testify to that, and even in India and other places, it's unthinkable not to take care of your parents. And maybe we should remind ourselves of what Charles Haddon Spurgeon says, and that is, what you are at home is what you are. Ladies, true religion begins at home and how we care for our parents. This is holiness. This is godliness, repaying our parents. So the idea here is we pay them back for all they did for us when we were growing up. If they have children or grandchildren, they pay them back. Ladies, think about it. Your parents, hopefully, they made sure you had food, clothing, shelter. They took you to endless sporting events, practices, piano lessons, school events, church, hopefully, the doctor. They were up with you in the night, you know, when you were sick. They nursed your wounds, both physically and emotionally. They disciplined you, hopefully, when you needed it. They instructed you and raised you to be a decent human being. You know, when you think about it, we can never pay back our parents the debt that we owe them, just like we can never pay back our Lord for our salvation. But lady, as children with parents, we are to endeavor to pay them back in their old age. Your mother took care of you when you were young, and now it's your turn to take care of her. This is your God-given responsibility. In fact, I remember a particular visit when my dad was still living, and I was pushing him around in his wheelchair. We were either at the zoo or we were taking a walk at the veterans home, and my dad said, "Susie," he said, "I wish you didn't have to do that." He said, "I know I'm really heavy, and I wish you didn't have to push me around in this wheelchair." And I said, "Daddy," I said, "I am sure when I was a little girl that you pushed me around a lot in a stroller." And I said, "And I know you carried me, because I have a picture of him holding me in my office. I was probably about 4 years old, and he was holding me." And I said, "And I'm sure you carried me around, did you not?" And I said, "And I'm sure it was difficult." And he said, "Yes, I did, and yes, it was." And so that was the end of that conversation. You know, we need to remind ourselves of one of the 10 Commandments: honor your father and mother, that your days may be long on the earth. Also, Ephesians 6:2, honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it might go well with you and your days will be long on the earth. Ladies, you know there's 2 promises there for honoring your father and your mother. A long life and a good life. I don't know about you, but that sounds good. In fact, I've often wondered, when people die young, I've wondered, did they honor their mother? Did they honor their father? It'd be interesting to do a study on that sometime. Ladies, this is a wonderful, wonderful promise for long life and that things go well. That's a good deal. And Paul goes on to say, not only is that a good deal, but it's a good deal because notice what he says. It's good and acceptable before God to take care of your parents. It's interesting, this is the same Greek wordage that we had in 1 Timothy 5. Remember when we were instructed, or 1 Timothy chapter 2, when we were instructed to pray for our governing leaders, our president and the vice president and all that. And remember, one of the reasons we are to pray for our governing leaders is because it is good and acceptable in the sight of God our Savior. Remember, and are you all still praying for your governing leaders? You're supposed to be. We saw back then, it means the same thing it means now. This, God considers it excellent. God considers it beautiful. God considers it admirable to care for the widows in your family, just like he considers it good, excellent, and admirable to pray for our president and our leaders. It's also acceptable, Paul says, which means he gladly receives it with satisfaction. He gladly receives it with satisfaction. Ladies, our care for our widowed family members are well-pleasing to God and viewed by him as a good thing. Not a bad thing, a good thing. This verse right here is a rebuke to our culture who does not care for widows. In fact, I have known people who have taken an aged parent into their home, a mother or a father, and they've been criticized for it. I've even known people that have actually moved out of one state into another state to be near their aged parent or move in with their aged parent to take care for them, and they've been criticized for it. You know, why are you doing that? I mean, this is your time in life. Your kids are gone, and, you know, you need to live it up. Why are you wasting your time? Put them in a nursing home. My friend, this is the righteous thing to do. I think too many of us are like the Pharisees in Mark 7:11. Remember, they were giving money to the temple in lieu of helping their parents, and they were excusing the neglect of the care of their parents by giving money to the temple, or we might say putting money in the offering plate. You know what Jesus says to them? The word of God has no effect on you. Has no effect on you. You don't understand. You take that money and take care of your parent. Don't give the money to the temple and cry out, Corban, Corban. We're excused, we're excused. Ladies, be reminded, pure and undefiled religion for God and Father is this, to what? Visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction, and keep oneself unspotted from the world. In fact, Paul is very clear later on in verse 16, if you'll look down there, we'll get to this next week. He says, if any man or woman that believes has widows, let them relieve them. That's who's to take care of them. Do not let the church be charged. Why? So that the church can be freed up to take care of the real widows, the real ones that are destitute, not the defended widows that have family to take care of her. So the defended widow is provided for by her family. Now, Paul goes back to the destitute widow in verse 5. Notice what he says. Now she who is really a widow and left alone, trusts in God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. Now, the word widow here is the same wordage that he used in verse 3, a real widow. And here he defines it a bit by saying, she is left alone. She's left alone. The Greek word here is monos, which means only or alone. She's left alone. She has nobody. She's without a husband, either by death, divorce, or being single. But she's not alone in the sense that she has God. She trusts in God day and night. Ladies, this reminds me of what Jesus said to the disciples in the upper room discourse before he went to heaven. He said, indeed, the hour is coming, yes, the hour is come, and you will all scatter and leave me alone. But he says, I am not alone. I'm not alone. The Father is with me. And she's not alone either. She has God. And she manifests that by, notice, trusting in Him and praying night and day. She completely relies on God for everything. In fact, a great example of this, I think I had you look at in your homework, is Anna. Remember in Anna in Luke chapter 2? She was a prophetess and she'd been without a husband for 7 years. And she was 84 years of age, and it says she did not depart from the temple, but she served God with fasting and praying night and day. That's what a lot of widows should be doing. Widows like Anna, who are destitute, have an attitude of whether it's night or day to be dependent on God for everything. He's her husband, and she depends on Him. So, during the day, when anxious thoughts arise, she takes them to the Father. In the night, when she's awake and she's troubled, she cries out to her heavenly husband. In fact, there's one widow in Mark 12 that most assuredly trusted in God, even though she was desolate. Remember, Jesus commended her when she put everything she had into the offering plate. And here was a widow who truly trusted in God, so much so that she gave everything she had because she knew God would provide for her. So, a destitute widow not only needs to be provided for by the church, but also she trusts in God and prays. She trusts in God and prays. Now, there is a widow that Paul describes next, and thankfully he only gives her one verse. I'm very thankful for that. She's a dead widow. A dead widow. Notice what he says in verse 6. But she who lives in pleasure is dead while she lives. Again, we have the Greek word but, a contrast. Instead of depending on God night and day, instead of being in prayer all the time, this dead widow, she takes matters in her own hands, and she lives immorally as a means of supporting herself. She plunges into dissipation. In fact, Paul puts it like this. She who lives in pleasure is dead while she lives. Interesting verse. Did you notice that Paul in verse 6 doesn't even call her a widow? He just says she. It's like, she. Kind of different than the destitute and the defended widow. She's a dead widow. She. In fact, lives in pleasure comes from a root word that means to weave at a fast rate, which indicates a lavish excess. In fact, there's a slight sense in the Greek word of sexual immorality. It's very similar to what James says to the rich people in James 5:5. He says, you've lived on the earth, you've lived in pleasure and luxury, and you have fattened your hearts for the day of slaughter. Just living it up. She pampers herself, she indulges herself in food, drink, luxurious and voluptuous living. In fact, the Greek, as I said, hints here that she might even be engaging herself in prostitution as a means to make a living, because she's now without a husband. And so she might be involved in sexual immorality in order to support herself. Ladies, these widows who live for pleasure and worldliness are not to be put on the widow's list. They're not to be put on the list. Her husband is now dead, and she's living it up. She's not living for God. In fact, Paul says she's dead, which means she is dead spiritually. Obviously, she's not dead physically because she's alive, and he's talking about her. She is dead spiritually. She's never been born again to new life. But honestly, she might as well be dead physically too, because those things don't bring happiness, right? In fact, one man says this: there has been 2 deaths, 2 funerals. Her husband died, and the spiritual life in her died. He is a corpse, she's a living one, and her state is far worse than his. So, the dead widow is obviously not provided for by her family or by the church, but her provision is pleasure. That's what it is. Her provision is pleasure, at least in this life, but ladies, not in the life to come. Well, Paul now writes a sentence that can have 3 meanings, and I will give it to you briefly, because all 3 of them are possible and probable, so they all would fit in the text. He says in verse 7, these things command that they may be blameless. So the question comes to mind, what are these things that Paul is to command, and who are the ones that are blameless? Well, 3 possible meanings. One possible meaning is this: Timothy is to make sure the church understands that they are to financially care for the destitute widows, and thus they will be blameless. Or he could be saying, you command family members to provide for their parents, thus they will be blameless by being obedient, by taking care of their parents. And yet another possibility, Timothy is to command these dead widows, these widows that are living in pleasure, to not be involved in the things that they're involved in, so that they can be blameless and then put on the list. It's probably one of the first 2 interpretations, but I can't say I'd be dogmatic on any one of these possible interpretations, because they all have some validity. But Paul now continues on with the defended widow, the one who has family to provide for her, and notice what he says in verse 8. If anyone does not provide for his own, and especially though of his own household, he's denied the faith, and he is worse than an unbeliever. So here again in verse 8, Paul reminds families again, and ladies, anytime anything is repeated in Scripture, it is there for emphasis. He reminds them again, you are to provide for your own. In fact, the Greek word here means financial provision. Financial provision. In fact, the word provide means to plan ahead, plan before. And so it would indicate, as a family member, ladies, we should be thinking ahead about our aged parents and how it is that we, as their children, are going to take care of them. I remember one of the first conversations that my husband and I ever had, and it might have even been before we got married. He made it very clear to me, Susan, I am committed to taking care of our parents. He said, I want you to know right up front, in their old age, they're going to move in with us. Your mother, your dad, my dad, all of them. And even our grandparents at that time when we got married, his grandparents were dead, but I had one set of grandparents that was still living. Now 40 years have passed since then, and things didn't turn out like we hoped. We tried to move his mom in with us, and she didn't want to because she thought our lives were too busy. And we tried to, my mom died suddenly of a heart attack, and we tried to move my grandma in with us, but we had family members that didn't want us to do that. And most of you know the story about my dad. We tried that too. And things didn't work out like we hoped, but we were committed to taking care of our parents if that's what God had for us. In fact, Joseph, as you saw in your homework, he is, I think, a great example of providing for those of his own household. Not just his dad, but his brothers as well. He took care of them and made sure that they were fed and clothed. And you know, he's really a stark contrast to our culture today, who does not love and care for our parents. In fact, Paul goes on to tell us how bad this is if we don't provide for them. Notice what he says. We've denied the faith and we're worse than an unbeliever. True religion is what? Visit the fatherless and the widows in their affliction. We've denied the faith, we're worse than an unbeliever. Ladies, we might proclaim to be a Christian like the Pharisees crying Corban, but we don't live it if we don't provide for our own. How can we say we belong to God and not live like we belong to God? True religion is visiting the fatherless and the widows in their affliction. In fact, anything else, as James would say, is dead faith. It's dead faith. It's not real. And Paul says we're not just an unbeliever, but we're worse than one. Now that's pretty extreme, isn't it? It's not that we're just not an unbeliever, we're worse than an unbeliever. Worse than an unbeliever. Ladies, unbelievers often provide for their parents, so why wouldn't a believer? That's awful, isn't it? In fact, I have an unbelieving family member. She's without Christ. And do you know, she puts the rest of us to shame, because when my parents were living, my sister bought a house for my mother, and of course she had the means to do it, but she made sure that my mother was taking care of him while my dad was still living. She was always sending him things and trying to help him whatever way she could, and even taking care of him and his wife. And she put many of us who claim to be Christians to shame by the way that she would care for my parents. One man says, the Christian who falls below the best heathen standard of family affection is the more blameworthy, since he has, what the heathen has not, the supreme example of love in Jesus Christ. End of quote. Well, Paul has reminded the family members again of their need to provide for the widows in their family, but now he turns with those who are truly destitute and are to be provided for by the church. And as he does, he lists 3 things that must be in this widow's life for her to qualify to be put on a list in order to be cared for by the church. Notice what he says in verse 9. Do not let a widow under 60 years old be taken into the number, and not unless she's been the wife of one man. Now, in order to understand this, you might be going, what is going on here? What is he talking about? Well, remember in Acts chapter 6, there was a murmuring among the Grecians because the widows were neglected in the daily ministration. Remember, the New Testament church had started, and all of a sudden, you know, there's all these widows, and like, what do we do with these widows? And so because of this, they were complaining, you know, these widows aren't being taken care of. What are we going to do about these widows? And remember, the apostles said, you know, we've got to be devoted to the word and prayer, so we're going to appoint 7 men who will take care of this business. And so evidently at that time when the New Testament church was beginning, there was actually a widow's list. And those 7 deacons that were appointed back then in Acts chapter 6 were beginning to see, well, who qualifies to be put on this list in order to be taken care of. So evidently in the New Testament church, there was actually a list of widows, and there had to be requirements for you to be put on the list. In fact, the words taken into the number seem to indicate to be enrolled and put on the list. So the first requirement of a widow that has to be put on the list is she must not be under 60. She has to be 60 or above. In fact, my daughter was telling me that, she went, Mom, you're going to be 60 soon. I said, no, I've got another year, a little over a year. Don't rush me. But it sounds really old. But and maybe you think it's odd, but in the biblical world, 60 would have been considered old because people didn't live as long as they do now. And I mean, I'm thinking 90 or 100 sounds old, but she thought 60 sounded old. And he's going to address the younger widows in the following verses, and he's going to tell them to remarry. As, in fact, my husband used to bug Debbie all the time. He said, I'm going to bug you till you turn 60. You need to get married. You need to get married. Now she's above it, so he doesn't bug her anymore about that. Secondly, she has to have been the wife of one man. Now, this doesn't mean she couldn't have been married a couple times, you know, if her husband, if she was biblically divorced, or I know Elizabeth Elliot, she's on her third husband now. All of her husbands have died, But it means the same thing as we saw the qualifications for the elders. She has to be a one-man woman. She couldn't be a polygamist. She couldn't have, been living it up. And so she's been devoted to one man only. Paul goes on with one more qualifying factor for these widows, if they're to be put on the list in verse 10. Well reported of for good works, if she's brought up children, lodged strangers, washed the saints' feet, relieved the afflicted, and diligently followed every good work. So the third qualifying factor is that she has to be known for having done good works. It's like Dorcas, who died in Acts chapter 9, and remember Peter comes to heal her, raise her from the dead, and all the widows are standing around weeping and crying, look at all these things that she made. And in fact, it describes her as a woman who was involved in charitable deeds. She was full of good works. And then Paul lists 5 of those good works that she should have been involved in. First one is bringing up children. Now, this could be her own children, or in biblical times, there were so many widows, there were a lot of orphans in those days. And so it could be her own children she's raised, or it could have been someone else's. She could have raised orphans. Secondly, she's to have lodged strangers. This would be hospitality. In biblical times, remember, there weren't a lot of places to stay, and so travelers would often travel usually about 20 miles a day, and they'd come into town, and remember Joseph and Mary, they couldn't find a place to stay, and so as a woman, we would open our homes and open them to complete strangers. Thinking of travelers, this would be the third good work. She's to have washed the saints' feet. Now maybe you're thinking, well, you know what? I ain't ever going to be put on a widow's list because I ain't ever washing anyone's feet. But again, it was common for people in biblical times. Again, they would walk 20 miles a day. That was the average walk for during biblical times. They didn't have, cars and all that stuff. And most of the time, they would just have sandals. Sometimes it'd be barefoot. They didn't have Nike tennis shoes or boots or anything like that. And so when you would invite these travelers into your home, you would usually offer to wash their feet, just like Jesus did with the disciples. Oddly enough, when I was working on this lesson, I had just walked 20 miles with Debbie. I don't know why we did that, but we did that. And actually walked 23 miles, but it was exhausting. And I honestly would have loved a foot washing. I did get a foot rub from Doug the next day, but no foot washing. But can you imagine, after walking 20 miles, how tired your feet would be and dirty from, all the dust that would be on the roads? You might say, well, how would this be equivalent today? Well, today you might offer somebody a cold drink or a place to rest. You might take a glass of water out to the mailman on the hot summer day, or a hot cocoa or something like that. If you want to wash their feet, I guess you could. The fourth thing she's to have participated in is relieving the afflicted. This means she ministers to the sick. She encourages people that need encouragement, maybe taking a meal to them, if they're destitute in some way, providing food for them. And then lastly, he lumps it all together by saying if she's diligently followed every good work. This means she just goes about doing good. She looks for opportunities to be a blessing to others. In fact, in biblical times, widows were known for the ones who would prepare the water for baptism or get the ladies ready for baptism. Widows were known for prayer, for fasting. They visited the sick. They helped the orphans. They were all also known as intercessors for the church, and they followed after every good work. So, in considering the destitute widow, she's not only provided for by the church, but she trusts in God, she prays, she's 60 plus years, she's a one-man woman, she's involved in good works. So when you lump it all together, a destitute widow, the church is her provision; a dead widow, pleasure is her provision; a defended widow, the family is her provision. So you can kind of narrow it down like that. Destitute widow, church is her provision; a dead widow, pleasure is her provision; and a defended widow, family is her provision. So let's talk about these. Destitute widow. Do you know who are the widows in your church who are truly destitute? Do you know any widows in your neighborhood, maybe, who are destitute? Do you know any widows who are destitute? Do you know their financial needs, their emotional needs, their spiritual needs? How are you caring for them? Are you now preparing yourself for that list if the time comes that you need to be put on it, ladies, especially those of you that are almost 60 like me? Are you devoted to your husband? Do you trust in God and pray often? And could I say to you very kindly this evening that if you don't trust God tonight and pray to Him often, that it's not going to come natural when He dies either. So might as well get started now praying night and day. But if you're already depending on Him when your husband dies, then that will be a natural outflow when that day comes that God takes him. Are you involved in good works? What good works are you involved in? Are you relieving the afflicted, washing the saints' feet, and being hospitable? Secondly, we have the dead widow. Do you know any of those? Have you compelled them to the cross to give up their sinful lifestyle while there is time? Embrace God alone. What about your life now? Are you living it up and finding pleasure in the things of this world? Ladies, it does have pleasure for a season, but payday will come, and it does have its consequences. And lastly, the defended widow. Do you have family members who are widows, and are you doing your part to care for them? How are you caring for them? Remember, dear sister, your children are watching how you treat your parents, and they are learning from you on how to treat you when you are old. My husband used to say often to me when things were difficult in caring for our parents, he'd say, remember, Susan, our children are watching us, and they are going to treat us the same way we treat our parents. And that was a mild rebuke to me to adjust my attitude. We have reminded ourselves of James 1:27, pure and undefiled religion is to visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction and keep oneself unspotted from the world. But do you know also James says this, what does it profit, my brother, if a man says, I have faith and have not works? Can faith save him? If a brother or sister is naked and destitute of daily food, and you say to him, be warm, be filled, but you don't give him those things that are necessary, what does it profit? Faith without works is dead. So maybe you're wondering, Susan, how do I visit or relieve widows in my culture? The best thing to do is to ask them, which is what I did. I interviewed several widows, and I asked them 2 questions, and not just women in this church. I know widows that are outside of this church. The first question I ask is, what is or what was the hardest thing about being a widow? Here are the answers I received. The hardest things are, the nights are very lonely. I don't have a man to bounce ideas off. It's hard not having a guy in my life to fix things and maintain things. I don't have enough money to fix things. I wish someone would do my yard work. One woman told me, she said, things were new to me. I didn't know how to do my finances. In fact, I was at my son's church this last week, and I sat by the elder's wife that I mentioned a few weeks ago who died suddenly. I sat next to her. She knew nothing when her husband died. She didn't know how to get into the computer. She didn't know passwords. She didn't know how to pay bills. She didn't know how to get the car fixed. She knew absolutely nothing. And by the way, this is not in my notes, but I would encourage you as women, you need to know those things. You need to know your finances. You need to know how to pay bills. It would be good to have a few of those things on hand just in case you become a widow. One woman said she didn't know how to take care of her finances. And she said to me, she said, we had couple friends, and all of a sudden when my husband died, those couple friends were no longer my friends anymore. So I had no friends. The second question I asked was, how can you be best ministered to as a widow? And here are the answers I got. The answers I received were to be included in night activities, to give me a phone call now and then, to receive help when help is asked for. In fact, I got this answer twice from women in my church. I'm just ashamed to say that they have asked for help and they have not received the help, not financial help, but just things around the house they need help with, and they didn't get the help they needed. And I think I shall talk to my husband about that so he can talk to the deacons about that, or the elders, or whoever. Another thing I got was knowing that others are praying for me, maintaining fellowship with other believers. And one woman actually told me, she said, Susan, I really didn't have any needs at all. She said the Lord always took care of my needs and ministered to me by His presence. Well, my friend, let us remember those who are widows indeed, and let's relieve them in their affliction. Remember, statistics tell us that men usually die first. which means that most of us in this room who are married may soon find ourselves without a husband, and we too will want to be remembered in our affliction. So let's do unto others as we would have them do unto us. Let's pray. Oh, Father, I pray that you will forgive us for not looking after those that are within our congregation, in our neighborhoods, that are without, that they don't have husbands, and they might not need financial support, but Lord, they might need a hug, they might need a phone call, they might need to be invited over for dinner, just simple things, Lord. And so I pray that you will help this lesson to linger in our minds. And even as I taught tonight, Father, I remembered my aunt who lives here in town. I hadn't even considered her, and I pray that I could find a way perhaps to minister to her. And so, Lord, I just pray that you will help us to be obedient to your word and just to look out for those, and not just widows. I think of orphans too, Lord. We are surrounded by children that have no parents, and pray that we would be able to figure out how to minister to them as well. I thank you for this lesson, and I pray, Lord, that as women we would be put on the list because we do follow after every good work, and I pray that we would be diligent to obey the commands in Titus 2 and to make sure that we are following after you. Thank you for the time we've had, and I pray that you would give us safe trips home and rest tonight, that we might wake up tomorrow refreshed to serve you with strength. I pray this for Christ's sake. Amen.